Passenger mocks veteran's simple jacket until he reads the patches. Jake Saunders was on his way from Dallas to Chicago, another routine trip that he barely paid attention to anymore. For Jake, flights had become part of the rhythm of his life, just another way to hop from meeting to meeting, networking event to networking event, chasing down clients or sealing deals. At only 32, Jake had carved out a successful career in sales at a large technology firm, something he was proud of and worked relentlessly to maintain. Every flight felt like a testament to his ambition, his purpose. He didn't take days off and rarely indulged in vacations. Success, as Jake saw it, demanded sacrifice and tireless effort. Before we can continue, if you support veterans, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. The airport, with its endless lines, bright screens, flashing boarding instructions, and hurried travelers, was his second home. In Jake's world, time was money, and his impatience with anything that threatened to waste it was something he didn't hide. As he made his way through the crowd to his gate, he wore a tailored suit and carried a leather briefcase, a sharp, almost intimidating look that helped him project the image he wanted. Polished, professional, no nonsense. He had always believed that a person's appearance was a reflection of their values and success. If you dressed well, you commanded respect. If you didn't, well, you'd find yourself relegated to the sidelines, unremarkable. Boarding the plane, Jake felt the familiar wave of irritation as people fumbled with their bags or blocked the aisle while chatting with companions. He sighed, tapping his fingers on his briefcase as he waited for a mother struggling to organize her child's belongings. When he finally reached his row, he saw that he'd be sitting next to an elderly man wearing what could only be described as an old, tattered jacket. Jake's first impression was a wave of disdain, mingled with annoyance. He assumed the man, probably on a budget ticket, would be an inconvenience for the duration of the flight. As he slipped into his seat and glanced to his side, Jake couldn't help but notice the stark difference between his meticulously tailored suit and the man's attire. The jacket looked ancient, perhaps from the 1970s or earlier, and it bore visible signs of age, faded colors, fraying at the cuffs, and patches that seemed to have been sewn on over decades. The jacket was decorated with insignias, badges, and other small symbols that Jake didn't immediately recognize, but that didn't matter to him. He assumed they were relics of no particular importance, mere decorations from a different time, maybe even a reflection of the man's unwillingness to let go of the past. Jake's eyes roamed over the details of the jacket, his judgment building with every second. He had no patience for sentimentality. To him, it was a sign of weakness, a way to avoid moving forward. He believed that people should adapt, update, and embrace change, whether in their wardrobe, career, or life. To him, being successful was about leaving the past behind and embracing the present, or better yet, the future. The elderly man's appearance, by Jake's standards, reeked of a bygone era, of someone stuck in a world that no longer existed. To make matters worse, the man's presence made Jake feel uncomfortable, as if the old jacket somehow diminished his own aura of success and modernity. Jake had meticulously built his image, and he didn't want it tarnished by association. After all, he thought, people judge you by the company you keep. Sitting next to someone so out of place felt like a disruption to the carefully cultivated life he had worked so hard to establish. As they settled in, and the plane began taxiing down the runway, Jake's annoyance only grew. He shifted in his seat, trying to distract himself, but he couldn't resist another glance at the man's jacket. The insignias began to catch his eye. There was one that said U.S. Army, and another shaped like a heart, a purple heart he vaguely recalled from somewhere. For a fleeting moment, Jake wondered if these were military awards, but he quickly brushed the thought aside, choosing instead to focus on his own concerns. His phone buzzed with emails, and he began scrolling through them, reassuring himself of his own importance. The man beside him, however, seemed oblivious to Jake's silent judgment. He was calm, his posture upright but relaxed, his eyes focused on the view outside the small airplane window. His hands rested on his lap, fingers lightly tracing the edge of one of the patches, as if each one held a story only he could see. Occasionally, he'd glance around the plane, offering polite smiles to the flight attendants and passengers who walked by, acknowledging them with a slight nod. Jake noticed these small gestures but found them almost irksome, thinking the man was drawing attention to himself unnecessarily. In his mind, Jake toyed with the idea of making a comment about the jacket, something subtle but cutting, to convey his opinion on the need for modernity. After all, he reasoned he was just being honest. A quick jab might remind the man that times had changed and perhaps encourage him to consider updating his wardrobe. But he hesitated, thinking better of starting a conversation that could lead to an uncomfortable situation. The last thing he wanted was to get bogged down in small talk on a flight that he just wanted to get through as efficiently as possible. Still, his irritation lingered, and he found himself becoming fixated on the jacket's patches. Each one seemed to tell a story, though he couldn't quite decipher them. The words and symbols began to pull at his curiosity, despite his resistance. He recognized a date, 1968. He saw names of places he vaguely recalled from history class, Da Nang, Hue, Khe Sanh. He could no longer deny the realization slowly creeping into his mind. The man beside him was not just an elderly passenger, but a Vietnam War veteran. Jake's initial feelings of superiority wavered, replaced by a sense of discomfort and, reluctantly, respect. This realization didn't come easily. Jake's mind still clung to the idea that success was about the present and the future, about achieving and maintaining an image that spoke to ambition, not relics of the past. But the presence of this man, with his quiet dignity and the symbols of his service, was beginning to unravel Jake's confidence in these beliefs. He felt himself being pulled into an unfamiliar emotional state, one that made him question his own values. As the plane reached cruising altitude, Jake glanced over at the man again, but this time with a mix of curiosity and a quiet sense of guilt. He realized he had never once considered what this man might have gone through in his life, what these patches represented to him. Each insignia, each metal sewn onto the fabric was likely a piece of a painful history, a memory of something he had survived. Jake's earlier irritation now felt hollow, shallow, as if he were somehow wrong in his initial assessment. He thought about his own life, his career, and his endless drive for success. Everything he had done was rooted in a desire for validation, for approval from others who shared his narrow vision of achievement. He had always believed that people were only worth as much as their outward accomplishments, their ability to impress. But sitting beside this man, he began to question whether he had been looking at life too superficially. For the first time, he wondered if perhaps he had missed something deeper in his quest for success. This discomfort grew as he observed the man's gentle demeanor, his polite interactions with those around him, and his clear comfort in his own skin. The man didn't seem to care about Jake's judgment or anyone else's on the plane. He seemed at peace, as though he had nothing left to prove to anyone. The jacket, worn and patched as it was, told a story of resilience, of bravery, of a life lived with purpose that went beyond appearances. Jake felt a pang of shame. He had spent years building an image, a facade, carefully crafted to earn the approval of others, yet here was a man who wore his history openly, with no concern for how it might be perceived. This realization gnawed Jake, and he shifted uncomfortably in his seat, feeling his worldview shaken, if only slightly. As the flight continued, Jake found himself struggling with these conflicting emotions, torn between his old beliefs and this newfound respect for the man beside him. He no longer felt the urge to judge or to belittle. Instead, he felt an overwhelming urge to understand, to know the stories behind those patches, to learn about the journey that had shaped this man into someone who wore his past without shame. And so, Jake sat there, quietly humbled, a little more aware of the world beyond his own ambitions, beginning to sense that perhaps there was more to life than the relentless pursuit of success. As the flight settled into its rhythm, Jake found himself replaying his initial reactions to the elderly man's jacket. Normally, he wouldn't give a second thought to someone who didn't fit his idea of professionalism or modernity. Jake had grown used to making quick judgments. It was, in his mind, part of what made him effective in his career. Seeing someone who clung to relics from the past, as the old man did, reminded Jake of everything he tried to distance himself from. It was as if the man's mere presence was challenging his core beliefs, and Jake felt almost compelled to put those beliefs into words, to reaffirm his own worldview. He glanced at the man again, wondering if a remark, some clever comment, would put things in perspective, perhaps even help the man realize that holding on to outdated symbols wouldn't get him anywhere. Jake began mentally drafting a remark that he hoped would be sharp but not overtly offensive. Perhaps he'd comment on how unusual it was to wear such a jacket in this day and age, or make a reference to how the corporate world rewarded people who looked forward, not back. In Jake's mind, he believed he'd be doing the man a favor. After all, hadn't he spent his whole career learning how to present himself in a way that commanded respect? The elderly man, to him, seemed like someone who'd missed that lesson entirely. Jake was not a cruel person by nature, but he believed in the power of a first impression. He had spent years building up his own image, carefully choosing his suits, his accessories, even the way he carried himself. He believed these choices showed his drive, his ambition, his commitment to moving forward and not dwelling on the past. As he mulled over his potential comment, Jake glanced over at the man, only to find him looking back with a gentle, patient smile. Caught off guard, Jake quickly averted his gaze, clearing his throat and pretending to be engrossed in his phone. The man's smile lingered in his mind, however, and he felt a small but unexpected sense of warmth radiate from it. That smile wasn't one of challenge or defensiveness. It was simply kind, understanding even, as if the man could sense Jake's inner turmoil and was patiently waiting for him to sort through it. Jake wasn't used to being on the receiving end of such a look. Something about that smile made him hesitate. Suddenly, he questioned the necessity of his planned remark. Why did he feel the need to express his opinion to this stranger? Why was he so bothered by what the man wore? The questions lingered, making him uncomfortable, as if some part of him knew the answers weren't as simple as he'd like to believe. Jake had always prided himself on not being sentimental, on focusing only on what mattered to his career, but now, in the presence of this unassuming man, he was beginning to realize that his aversion to the past was more than just a matter of personal philosophy. Slowly, Jake's curiosity began to grow, overtaking his initial desire to criticize. His eyes drifted back to the patches on the man's jacket, this time with genuine interest rather than judgment. He began to wonder about the stories behind them, stories that must have involved courage, hardship, and resilience. The names on the jacket, names of places like Khe Sanh and Da Nang, were vaguely familiar to him. They stirred memories from history classes he'd mostly forgotten, but he remembered enough to know that they were significant, part of a history that was dark, violent, and painful. It was then that he began to realize just how little he knew about the sacrifices people like this man had made. Jake had always considered himself well-read, informed, someone who kept up with world events and trends, but he felt an uncomfortable gap in his knowledge when it came to the history of wars, particularly ones that felt so distant from his own life. He'd read articles and seen movies, but he'd never really understood the personal toll war took on the individuals who fought in them. This man beside him, with his quiet dignity and worn jacket, was a living piece of that history, a history that Jake had dismissed without a second thought. Curiosity was now firmly in control. Jake felt a strange urge to know more, to hear the man's story. He glanced at the man again, noticing the gentle but weary way he held himself, as if each patch on his jacket were a weight he carried with pride but also with a certain resignation. Jake's mind raced with questions he didn't know how to ask. What had this man seen? What had he been through? Why did he still wear this jacket after all these years? At the same time, a part of him resisted the idea of striking up a conversation. He was used to talking to people with a purpose, clients, colleagues, potential partners, conversations that had clear outcomes and objectives. This conversation, however, felt different. There was no obvious gain for Jake, no professional advantage, no tangible reward. The only reason he felt compelled to talk to the man was purely out of human curiosity, a motivation he wasn't used to. It made him feel strangely vulnerable. As he considered these thoughts, Jake recalled something his father had once told him when he was younger. The past may not pay the bills, but it shows us where our courage and our values come from. At the time, Jake hadn't paid much attention to it. He'd been focused on his studies, his goals, and the idea of dwelling on the past had seemed unnecessary, even counterproductive. But now, sitting next to this man whose life experiences were far removed from his own, he wondered if he'd been wrong to dismiss his father's words so quickly. The flight attendants came through the aisle, offering refreshments. Jake accepted a coffee, while the elderly man took a small bottle of water. Jake watched as the man carefully unscrewed the cap and took a sip, his hands steady but marked with age, their calluses and wrinkles hinting at years of labor and hardship. Jake wondered what those hands had done, what they had built or carried, what lives they had saved. He began to feel the weight of his own superficial judgments, realizing just how little he knew about this man and, by extension, about the world beyond his own narrow focus. Trying to gather his thoughts, Jake considered how to approach the man without sounding patronizing or nosy. His curiosity had become a genuine desire to understand, but he didn't want to intrude. As the silence stretched on, he felt a growing sense of urgency, as if this opportunity to connect with someone so different from himself was slipping away. Jake took a deep breath, deciding that he couldn't ignore this moment any longer. He'd never forgive himself if he let his curiosity go unaddressed, and perhaps, he reasoned, this conversation could teach him something valuable, something he couldn't learn in a boardroom or from a sales pitch. Finally, he turned to the man, offering a tentative smile. "Excuse me, sir," he began, feeling strangely nervous. "I couldn't help but notice the patches on your jacket. Were you in the military?" His question was clumsy, but it was a start. The man looked at Jake with a warm, understanding expression, as if he had been expecting this question all along. He nodded slowly, his eyes reflecting a depth of experience that Jake could only begin to imagine. "Yes," he replied, his voice steady but soft. "I served in Vietnam, a long time ago now." There was a pause as the weight of those words settled between them. Jake felt his throat tighten, realizing that he was in the presence of someone who had not only lived through war, but had carried those memories with him for decades. The man's response was simple, unembellished, but it hinted at stories of courage, sacrifice, and loss that went far beyond Jake's understanding. The man, sensing Jake's interest, added quietly, "Each of these patches is a memory. They remind me of the people I served with, the friends I lost, and the things we did to survive." He paused, looking down at the patches, as if seeing them for the first time. "Wearing this jacket, it's my way of honoring them, of making sure they're not forgotten." Jake listened, struck by the honesty and vulnerability in the man's words. In that moment, he realized that his own desire to judge, to criticize, had been a barrier he'd built to avoid confronting something he didn't understand. This man's life, symbolized by a simple, worn jacket, represented a depth of experience that Jake had never considered, a world of courage and hardship that existed beyond the superficial success he had always pursued. In that moment, Jake's curiosity transformed into a profound respect. The man's story, though only hinted at, was enough to make him question everything he had believed about success and image. He felt a strange kinship with the man, a sense of gratitude for his willingness to share even a small part of his story. Jake knew that this conversation, this chance meeting, would leave a mark on him, forcing him to reevaluate the values he had clung to for so long. The conversation continued, slowly and thoughtfully, with Jake asking questions and the man answering with a quiet dignity that humbled him. What began as a simple spark of curiosity had blossomed into a rare moment of connection, one that would shape Jake's perspective in ways he couldn't yet fully understand. As the hum of the plane engines filled the cabin, Jake found himself in unfamiliar emotional territory. He'd spent the first half of the flight fixated on outward appearances, comparing his polished image to Sam's rugged, almost haunting simplicity. But after hearing Sam speak, a profound shift had occurred within him. For perhaps the first time, Jake felt himself truly compelled to understand another person without any professional motive, without the need for control or an immediate payoff. This curiosity felt raw, almost vulnerable, pushing him beyond his comfort zone. Jake wasn't entirely sure how to proceed. In his world, every conversation was a negotiation, a means to an end. He was accustomed to planning his words carefully, considering how they might sway the other person's perception in his favor. But sitting next to Sam, he felt all those instincts falter. He was treading on ground that didn't require persuasion or charm. Instead, it demanded openness, a willingness to listen without any agenda. Taking a deep breath, Jake decided to continue the conversation, even though he felt a strange discomfort as he spoke. "I can't even imagine what that was like," he said, his voice quieter than before. "Vietnam, I mean. I've read things, of course, but I don't think the books or movies could ever come close to what it must have been like to actually be there." Sam glanced over at Jake, his expression softening, as if he could sense the sincerity in Jake's words. "No, they really can't," he replied simply, his gaze drifting momentarily as if seeing scenes only he could envision. "War, it changes people. It shows you sides of yourself you'd rather not see, and it brings out things in others you'd never expect." Jake absorbed those words, realizing that Sam wasn't just talking about the violence or the physical hardships. He was describing something deeper, a psychological landscape of moral complexity and survival instincts that felt utterly foreign to Jake. Jake began to realize how little he truly understood about resilience and the internal battles a person might carry long after a conflict had ended. He knew nothing of what it meant to survive something as harrowing as war, to live with memories that would forever shape who you were. In an attempt to bridge the gap of his own ignorance, Jake ventured another question, careful to tread respectfully. How does one even begin to move on from something like that?" he asked, aware that his question was clumsy but hoping Sam would see his genuine interest. Sam took a moment before responding, his eyes focused somewhere far away. "You don't really." "Not entirely," he replied, his voice carrying a faint tremor, as if the memories were too large to fit into words. "You come back, and everyone expects you to pick up where you left off, to blend right back in like nothing happened. But a part of you never leaves that place. It clings to you, changes how you see everything." He paused, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing one of the patches on his jacket, as if drawing strength from it. "The friends I lost, the things I did, the things I couldn't prevent, they're all there, sewn into every part of me." For the first time, Jake felt a deep pang of empathy. He'd always thought of loss as something you got over, something you healed from with time. But as he looked at Sam, he realized that some wounds didn't close. They simply became a part of you, woven into your identity in ways you couldn't remove. In that moment, Jake felt humbled, aware of the limits of his own experiences and the privileges he'd taken for granted. He wanted to understand more, to learn from this man who had endured so much more than Jake could ever fathom. The plane continued to glide through the sky, and for a while, the two men sat in silence. Jake found himself reflecting on his own life, comparing it to the stories Sam had hinted at. Jake had always been focused on moving up, on crafting a future that matched his ambitions. He'd never taken the time to understand the sacrifices others might have made for the freedoms he enjoyed, or to think about the weight of history that others carried. This realization unsettled him, and he felt a strange sense of guilt creeping in. Had he really been so self-centered? After a pause, Jake decided to ask another question. "What keeps you going?" he asked softly, hoping his words wouldn't sound presumptuous. "After everything you've been through, I mean. What gives you strength?" Sam looked at Jake with a calm expression, as if he had been asked this question many times before. "Remembering them," he said simply. "My friends. The ones who didn't make it back. I live for them because they didn't get the chance. It's a way to honor them, to make sure that their lives meant something." Jake's throat tightened as he absorbed Sam's words. He had never considered the idea of living for others in such a profound way. In his world, strength was measured by individual achievements, by one's ability to rise above and succeed on their own terms. But Sam's perspective was fundamentally different. It was rooted in loyalty, in a bond that transcended even death. Jake felt a wave of admiration for Sam and a growing respect for the quiet dignity with which he carried his memories. Gradually, Jake found himself sharing more about his own life, his career, and the things he'd once considered important. He felt oddly vulnerable, almost childlike, as he spoke, realizing how trivial his concerns seemed in comparison to Sam's experiences. "I always thought that success meant climbing higher, getting more recognition, achieving more," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But now, I'm not so sure." Sam listened patiently, nodding in understanding. "Success is different for everyone," he replied thoughtfully. "For me, it's knowing that I've done my best to honor the people who mattered most to me. It's about integrity, about staying true to the promises I made." His words hung in the air, resonating with a clarity that Jake found both challenging and comforting. As the conversation deepened, Jake began to see Sam not as a relic of the past, but as a source of wisdom, a reminder of values he'd long overlooked. Sam's presence forced him to confront parts of himself he'd buried, questions he'd avoided, and truths he'd been reluctant to face. Jake realized that his success-driven life had been devoid of the very things that made Sam's journey meaningful: connection, purpose, and a sense of belonging to something larger than himself. Hours seemed to pass as they talked, their words blending into the steady hum of the plane. Jake could feel the boundaries of his old worldview crumbling, replaced by a growing awareness of the depth and complexity of life. For the first time, he felt a desire to connect with someone not as a competitor or a client, but as a fellow human being. The conversation was unlike any he'd had before. With each answer Sam gave, Jake felt himself drawn further into a reality he'd never known existed. He realized that he'd spent so much of his life building walls to protect himself from pain, from vulnerability, from anything that might threaten his carefully crafted image. But here, in this small, enclosed space, those walls seemed unnecessary. Sam's openness invited Jake to lower his guard, to embrace a part of himself he'd long ignored. As they continued talking, Jake felt a profound sense of gratitude for this chance encounter. He began to see it as more than a mere coincidence, as if fate had placed Sam beside him to teach him a lesson he hadn't known he needed. He knew that when he left this plane, he would carry Sam's words with him, along with a newfound understanding of what it meant to live a life of purpose. For Jake, this journey had started as a simple flight from Dallas to Chicago, a routine trip he'd made countless times before. But now, it had transformed into something far more meaningful, a journey of self-discovery, of confronting his own limitations and prejudices, and of learning from someone whose life experience was a testament to resilience and honor. As the plane prepared for landing, Jake looked at Sam one last time, feeling a sense of connection that transcended their differences in age, background, and beliefs. He knew that Sam's impact on him would last far beyond this flight, shaping the way he saw himself and the world around him. For the first time in his life, Jake understood that true strength wasn't about power or success, but about the courage to face life with integrity, compassion, and humility. As they exchanged a final handshake, Jake felt a deep sense of respect for the man beside him, a respect that had grown out of the very differences he'd once judged so harshly. In that moment, he realized that he was leaving the plane not just as a passenger, but as someone who had glimpsed a new path, a path marked not by ambition, but by a commitment to live with purpose and gratitude. As the plane leveled out and settled into its cruising altitude, Jake found himself grappling with a wave of conflicting emotions. The last few hours had stripped away layers of his self-assurance, leaving him with a mix of admiration, discomfort, and a nagging urge to question everything he'd believed about success, strength, and identity. For the first time in his adult life, he was unmoored, floating in unfamiliar waters without a clear path forward. This was a new kind of challenge for him, one that didn't involve deadlines, profits, or strategic moves. Instead, it demanded an openness he wasn't sure he possessed. As he glanced over at Sam, who had leaned back and closed his eyes, perhaps retreating into memories that would forever be his alone, Jake tried to process everything he'd learned from their conversation. The patches on Sam's jacket, the stories behind them, the sense of duty and sacrifice. These weren't just relics of the past. They were reminders of a life lived with purpose and resilience. Jake realized that he was facing a test of character, a silent invitation to adapt his worldview in a way that might alter his life's trajectory. For someone like Jake, who had always navigated life with a clear blueprint, this was a daunting task. He was used to setting goals and achieving them, to moving forward with unshakable confidence. Now, however, he was in a situation where success couldn't be measured by wealth or social status. The unfamiliarity of this new territory felt like a foreign language, one that Jake had to learn from scratch. He found himself wondering if he was even capable of making the changes he now felt compelled to embrace. In the days following the flight, Jake's mind kept returning to the moments he'd shared with Sam. Back in his office, he tried to bury himself in work, hoping that the stacks of reports, emails, and meetings would drown out the disquieting thoughts that had taken root in his mind. But each time he closed his laptop, he found himself haunted by the questions Sam had stirred within him. What did it mean to live with purpose? To honor those who had come before? To carry memories that, though painful, were worn with pride and dignity? Jake's friends and colleagues noticed a shift in him, though most couldn't quite pinpoint its cause. He was quieter than usual, his eyes often distant, as if he were listening to something only he could hear. He found himself questioning his reactions, holding back on the snide remarks or hasty judgments that had once flowed so easily. It was as if Sam's quiet resilience had left an imprint on him, making him more aware of his own tendency to dismiss others without understanding their stories. One evening, as Jake was preparing to meet a group of friends for drinks, he hesitated in front of his mirror, feeling an inexplicable sense of dissatisfaction with his appearance. He was dressed sharply, his suit tailored to perfection, yet something felt off. In the reflection, he saw a man who had spent years constructing an image of success, a man who looked the part but suddenly felt hollow. He remembered Sam's worn jacket, the patches that bore silent witness to battles fought and sacrifices made. Jake realized that while he had invested so much in appearances, he had neglected the deeper qualities that Sam embodied, qualities that couldn't be bought or tailored. When he arrived at the bar, Jake found himself disengaged from the usual banter. His friends were talking about recent promotions, new cars, luxury vacations, all the markers of success he had once valued so highly. But tonight, those topics felt empty, almost trivial. He tried to join in, laughing at jokes and nodding along with stories, but his mind kept drifting back to Sam. The disconnect between his old life and the insights he'd gained was becoming impossible to ignore. As the evening wore on, one of Jake's friends, Mark, noticed his distraction and leaned in. "Hey, you seem a little out of it tonight. Everything okay?" Mark asked, giving Jake a concerned look. Jake hesitated, debating whether to share his thoughts. He'd always been guarded about his inner world, preferring to keep conversations light and focused on professional achievements. But something in him had shifted, and he found himself wanting to be honest, even if it felt uncomfortable. "I met someone on my flight back from Dallas," Jake began, his voice low but steady. "An older guy, a Vietnam vet. He made me think about a lot of things I'd never really considered before." Mark raised an eyebrow, intrigued but slightly skeptical. "A Vietnam vet, huh? Didn't peg you for the sentimental type," he teased, though his tone was gentle. Jake chuckled, recognizing the irony. "Yeah, I didn't either," he admitted. But it wasn't just what he said. It was how he carried himself, like he'd been through hell, but didn't need anyone's sympathy. "I don't know, it just made me realize how much I focus on things that don't really matter." The conversation stirred something within him, prompting Jake to dig deeper into his newfound reflections. He found himself researching more about veterans, reading articles, watching documentaries, and diving into the stories of people who had served. Each story he encountered seemed to resonate with a new part of him, reinforcing the lessons Sam had imparted. For the first time, Jake began to see his own life as something that could be more than a pursuit of personal success. He felt an urge to contribute, to make a difference beyond the confines of his own ambitions. His transformation wasn't without challenges, though. Jake soon realized that adapting to a new perspective often meant facing parts of himself he wasn't proud of. He'd always prided himself on his sharp wit, his ability to read people and make quick judgments. But now, those qualities seemed shallow, even hurtful. He caught himself, more than once, reacting with impatience or dismissiveness, only to feel a pang of guilt afterward. The changes he wanted to make weren't easy, and he often felt as though he was wrestling with his own ingrained habits. One day, while out for a walk to clear his head, Jake came across a small veterans memorial in a park near his apartment. It was a modest stone plaque surrounded by a few benches and flags, a quiet space dedicated to those who had served. Jake sat down, feeling a strange sense of connection to the place. He imagined Sam sitting here, or someone like him, finding solace in the remembrance of lost friends and hard-fought battles. Jake found himself reflecting on the sacrifices others had made for the freedoms he took for granted, and he felt both humbled and inspired. In the weeks that followed, Jake began volunteering at a local veterans organization, helping with fundraisers and participating in events aimed at supporting those who had returned from service. It was a small gesture, but it felt meaningful, grounding him in a cause that extended beyond himself. The veterans he met reminded him of Sam in their quiet resilience, their lack of pretension, and their unspoken sense of duty. Jake felt as though he was part of something larger, a community bound by shared values that transcended his usual metrics of success. As Jake continued to adapt, he noticed subtle changes in his daily life. He became more patient with his coworkers, more understanding of their struggles, and more willing to lend a helping hand without expecting anything in return. He found himself listening more intently, recognizing that everyone he encountered carried their own stories, their own battles, even if they didn't wear them on their sleeves like Sam's patches. Jake realized that empathy, true empathy, required seeing beyond the surface and connecting with others on a deeper level. Eventually, Jake's transformation began to feel natural, as if he were rediscovering a part of himself that had been hidden all along. He was no longer just adapting to a new perspective. He was embracing it, allowing it to shape his choices, his interactions, and his vision for the future. He felt lighter, more grounded, and for the first time, genuinely fulfilled, not because of his achievements, but because of the connections he was building, the lives he was touching, and the sense of purpose he had found. The memory of that flight and Sam's presence had become a constant in Jake's life, a guiding light that reminded him of the strength found in humility and the courage required to live with integrity. He was still the same person, but now he saw the world, and himself, with clearer eyes, ready to move forward with a heart that had been opened, reshaped by the lessons of someone who had once been a stranger. Weeks had passed since Jake's fateful encounter with Sam, and Jake had fully immersed himself in the changes he'd set out to make. He had redirected his energy, swapping his usual routines for new activities that carried a deeper sense of purpose. The sense of emptiness he'd felt before meeting Sam had been filled by a commitment to help others, especially the veterans he had come to admire. Volunteering became part of his routine, and he took pride in each small act of service, raising funds, organizing events, and meeting veterans with stories both inspiring and humbling. Jake's friends and colleagues had noticed the transformation. He'd gone from being someone who never thought twice about his words or actions to a person who spoke and acted with deliberate kindness and empathy. Conversations with his friends, once focused on superficial subjects like work and social status, now veered into meaningful discussions about life, values, and purpose. Jake's friends couldn't quite recognize this new version of him, but they respected it, even if they sometimes teased him about the sudden change in outlook. One evening, Jake found himself at a fundraising dinner organized by the local veterans organization he had been working with. It was the kind of event he used to attend only for networking purposes, but tonight, his goal was different. He wanted to contribute to something greater than himself and show his gratitude to those who had served, people like Sam who had reshaped his life with a simple act of kindness and honesty. Dressed in a modest suit, he moved through the room, greeting the veterans and their families, sharing stories, and genuinely engaging with them. As the night unfolded, Jake's heart swelled with a sense of accomplishment. He was finally part of something meaningful, something that allowed him to make a difference. For years, he had chased success as defined by wealth and status, believing that these achievements would bring him fulfillment. But here, in the company of people who had sacrificed so much, he found a sense of belonging he had never known before. His dedication to the cause was genuine, and the praise he received from others at the event only reinforced his belief that he was on the right path. Throughout the evening, Jake couldn't help but think back to Sam. He wondered what Sam would think of him now, if he would be proud of the changes Jake had made. He hoped that Sam would see his efforts and recognize the impact he'd had on Jake's life. In his mind, he pictured Sam smiling approvingly, as if to say, "You've finally figured it out." This imaginary affirmation gave Jake a sense of peace, as though he had completed a journey and achieved the validation he had unknowingly been seeking. As he continued to circulate through the event, Jake met a young woman named Emily, whose father had served in Vietnam. Emily shared with him stories of her father's struggles with post-traumatic stress disorder and the challenges their family had faced as a result. Listening to her, Jake felt a profound sense of empathy and connection. Her story reminded him of Sam, and he realized that every veteran, every family member, carried a story that was both unique and universal in its experiences of hardship, sacrifice, and resilience. By the end of the night, Jake felt a deep satisfaction that bordered on euphoria. He had done something meaningful, something that extended beyond his own ambitions. People had thanked him, praised him for his efforts, and he felt as though he had finally arrived at the person he'd always wanted to be. The man who once measured success in financial terms was now someone who found value in service and compassion. He left the event with a renewed sense of purpose, convinced that he had achieved the transformation he'd set out to accomplish. Over the next few weeks, Jake continued to invest himself fully in his new life. He attended more veterans events, continued his volunteer work, and maintained the thoughtful, humble demeanor he had adopted. His actions seemed to be appreciated by everyone around him, and his friends, once skeptical, had come to accept this new Jake as the real Jake. At work, his colleagues remarked on how much calmer and more understanding he had become, and his boss even complimented him on his improved leadership skills, attributing them to a newfound maturity. Yet, as the initial glow of his transformation began to settle, Jake found himself wrestling with a subtle, persistent unease. Though he had achieved what he thought he wanted, a life of purpose, service, and humility, something still felt incomplete. In quiet moments, when he was alone with his thoughts, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was playing a role, performing an act that others praised, but that didn't fully resonate with his core. He had done everything right, followed the path of transformation he believed would bring him peace, yet an inner voice kept whispering that he was still missing something essential. Jake tried to ignore this voice, to silence it with more acts of service and goodwill. He threw himself into his work with the veterans, donated more money to their cause, and even began speaking at events about the importance of supporting those who had served. But the harder he tried, the louder the voice became. He felt as though he were chasing something he couldn't quite grasp, as though he were climbing a mountain only to find that the summit was still out of reach. One evening, after a particularly long day, Jake sat alone in his apartment, staring at the framed photograph he had taken with Sam on the flight from Dallas to Chicago. In the photo, Sam's eyes held a quiet wisdom, a kind of peace that Jake now realized he didn't possess. He had mistaken outward acts of service for inner transformation, believing that by changing his behavior, he could change his heart. But now he understood that true change went deeper, that it required not just action, but introspection, humility, and an acceptance of his own vulnerabilities. The realization hit him like a wave, overwhelming and humbling. He had been seeking validation from others, believing that their praise and admiration would confirm his worth. But true change, he now saw, was not about earning approval or fulfilling an ideal. It was about facing himself, acknowledging his flaws and insecurities, and accepting that he was still on a journey. He had been so focused on getting what he wanted that he had overlooked what he truly needed, a sense of peace that could only come from within. For the first time, Jake allowed himself to feel the weight of his own doubts and fears. He acknowledged the parts of himself he had tried to ignore, the impatience, the judgment, the need for control. He saw, with startling clarity, that his transformation was far from complete, that he had been chasing an image of himself rather than embracing the person he truly was. And in that moment, he felt a profound sense of release, as though he were finally letting go of a burden he had carried for far too long. As Jake sat in the quiet of his apartment, he realized that his journey wasn't about becoming someone new, but about becoming more fully himself. He didn't need to prove anything to Sam, to his friends, or even to himself. He simply needed to live with honesty, integrity, and an open heart. The peace he sought could not be found in the praise of others or in acts of service alone. It had to come from a place of inner acceptance, a willingness to confront his own weaknesses and embrace the journey, however imperfect it might be. This realization marked a turning point for Jake. He no longer felt the need to perform his new role or seek validation from those around him. Instead, he committed to living authentically, allowing his actions to flow from a place of genuine compassion rather than a desire for approval. He continued his work with the veterans, but now he approached it with a quiet humility, understanding that true service was not about recognition, but about presence and empathy. Jake's transformation had reached a new depth, one that went beyond outward actions and touched the core of who he was. He had gotten what he thought he wanted, a life of purpose and meaning, but in doing so, he had discovered something even more valuable, a sense of inner peace that came from embracing himself, flaws and all. He no longer needed to chase an ideal or seek the approval of others. He had found a deeper sense of fulfillment, one that transcended the need for validation and allowed him to simply be. In the end, Jake's journey was not about changing who he was, but about coming home to himself, to a place of acceptance and peace that could only be found within. He was still a work in progress, still learning and growing, but he no longer felt the need to prove anything. He had finally understood that true transformation was not about getting what you want, but about discovering what you truly need, and in that discovery, finding a peace that could never be taken away. Jake had thought he had found what he was looking for. He had changed his habits, embraced a new outlook, and received validation from everyone around him. But as the weeks turned into months, Jake realized that his efforts to change were beginning to feel hollow. He had assumed that by helping others, by giving back, and by adopting a new perspective, he could erase the parts of himself he didn't like. Yet a restlessness still simmered inside him, one he couldn't ignore any longer. The more Jake reflected, the more he realized that he had been relying on outward actions to give his life meaning. He had thrown himself into helping veterans and volunteering, hoping these acts of service would transform him into the person he wanted to be. But deep down, he knew he had only scratched the surface. While his actions were undeniably positive, they were also, in many ways, performative. He wanted to prove, both to himself and to others, that he was a changed man, a man of integrity, compassion, and purpose. But as he looked deeper, he recognized a painful truth. His motives weren't as pure as he'd wanted to believe. One evening, Jake was invited to speak at a charity event dedicated to veterans. It was a formal gathering with dignitaries, local officials, and other philanthropists, and Jake had been asked to share his experiences working with veterans. Standing at the podium, he began his speech, talking about the importance of gratitude, sacrifice, and humility. He spoke of Sam and the profound impact that single encounter had on his life. But as he spoke, a strange sensation washed over him. The words felt rehearsed, almost artificial. He realized that he was recounting his journey as if it were a story about someone else, polished, neat, and devoid of the raw honesty he had come to value. Mid-sentence, Jake faltered. The audience waited, but he struggled to find the words. He could feel the weight of his own facade closing in around him. In that moment, he understood that he had been using his volunteer work as a mask to cover his deeper insecurities. He had convinced himself that he was doing these things out of genuine compassion, but a part of him had always known that he was also trying to escape from his own fears and self-doubt. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The silence in the room grew heavier, and Jake felt exposed, as if everyone could see through his carefully constructed image. Stumbling through the rest of his speech, he finished as quickly as he could and left the stage, his heart pounding. He had hoped that this speech, this moment, would be a testament to his growth. But instead, it had forced him to confront the harsh reality that his journey was far from complete. The discomfort he felt was undeniable, and he could no longer pretend that his outward actions were enough. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but Jake knew that he had to face it if he wanted to move forward. That night, Jake returned to his apartment feeling utterly defeated. The admiration he'd received from others, the praise and accolades, suddenly felt meaningless. He sat in the dim light, grappling with the emptiness that had resurfaced, stronger and more insistent than ever. He thought back to Sam, remembering the quiet confidence and peace he had seen in the man's eyes. Sam's sense of purpose hadn't come from accolades or recognition. It had come from within. He had carried his experiences, both painful and honorable, with a quiet dignity that Jake now realized he lacked. As he sat alone, Jake began to understand the true price of his journey. He had been so focused on creating a new image of himself that he had neglected the inner work needed to sustain it. His outward actions had been a bandage, not a cure, and the wounds he had tried to cover were now bleeding through. It was a painful revelation, but Jake knew that he couldn't continue on this path without addressing the deeper issues he had ignored for so long. In the days that followed, Jake's sense of identity began to unravel. The once clear path he had laid out for himself now seemed uncertain, and he questioned everything he had come to believe about himself. He had thought that he could find meaning through service and self-sacrifice, but he realized that his efforts had been tainted by a need for validation and approval. He had sought to escape his own insecurities by helping others, but now he saw that true growth required facing those insecurities head-on. Jake withdrew from his volunteer work, needing time to reflect and reassess. His friends and colleagues noticed the change, but Jake avoided their questions. He was tired of putting on a facade, of pretending to be something he wasn't. For the first time, he allowed himself to sit with his discomfort, to feel the full weight of his unresolved pain. It was a dark and lonely process, but Jake knew it was necessary if he ever wanted to find true peace. One afternoon, as he walked through a quiet park, Jake encountered an older man sitting alone on a bench. The man's face was weathered, his eyes carrying the weight of experience. Without thinking, Jake sat down beside him, drawn by an inexplicable sense of connection. They exchanged pleasantries, and eventually, Jake found himself sharing his story, opening up about the struggles he had been facing. The man listened patiently, his gaze steady and compassionate. When Jake finished, the man offered a few words of wisdom that resonated deeply. "Change isn't about proving anything to anyone," he said. "It's about learning to live with yourself, flaws and all. You can't run from who you are, no matter how hard you try. True growth comes from accepting your own humanity, from finding peace with the parts of yourself you'd rather ignore." Jake felt a surge of gratitude for the man's words, and as he left the park, he knew that he had been given a new perspective on his journey. He realized that he had been seeking transformation as a way to escape from his past, to erase the parts of himself he didn't like. But now he understood that true growth required embracing those parts, not running from them. It was a difficult truth, but Jake felt a sense of relief in accepting it. Over the next few weeks, Jake began to approach his life with a new sense of honesty. He returned to his volunteer work, but this time, he did it without seeking recognition or approval. He focused on being present, on listening and learning from the people he served. He no longer felt the need to prove anything to himself or others. Instead, he embraced his imperfections, allowing them to guide him on a journey of self-acceptance. The journey was far from over, and Jake knew that he would continue to face challenges and setbacks. But for the first time, he felt at peace with the uncertainty. He no longer needed to create a perfect image of himself. He was content to simply be, to live with integrity and humility, knowing that true growth was a lifelong process. In the end, Jake had paid a heavy price for his journey. He had been forced to confront the parts of himself he had long ignored, to let go of the need for validation and embrace his own humanity. It had been a painful process, but it had also brought him closer to the person he wanted to be. He no longer felt the need to chase an ideal or seek approval from others. He had found a deeper sense of fulfillment, one that came from within, and he knew that this inner peace would be with him, no matter what challenges lay ahead. After months of inner struggle, Jake finally began to feel at peace. His journey had taken him through highs and lows, forcing him to confront parts of himself he had spent years avoiding. But he now knew that the person he was before meeting Sam, the person who had judged and belittled, was as much a part of him as the version he had strived to become. He had learned to accept his flaws, and with that acceptance came a genuine sense of calm. Returning to his day-to-day life was surprisingly easy, though he approached it with a renewed perspective. The office was still bustling, his colleagues still concerned with deadlines and promotions, but Jake no longer felt the same pressures he once did. He found satisfaction in his work, not for any recognition or external rewards, but because he was doing it with integrity. He was no longer worried about how others perceived him. Instead, he focused on building meaningful relationships and performing his responsibilities with sincerity. One of the first things Jake did upon his return was reach out to his old friends and reconnect with them on a deeper level. In the past, his friendships had been somewhat superficial, often based on shared ambitions or social convenience. Now, he was more intentional in his interactions. He listened to his friends, offered support without expecting anything in return, and shared parts of himself he had kept hidden before. His vulnerability was met with warmth and understanding, and he realized that true connection came from being genuine, not from putting up a facade. In one memorable conversation with a close friend, Jake opened up about his encounter with Sam and the journey that had followed. His friend listened intently, visibly moved by Jake's story. "You've really changed, Jake," he said, a note of admiration in his voice. "The old you would never have opened up like this." Jake smiled, accepting the compliment without the need to dwell on it. He understood now that change was not something to flaunt or seek validation for. It was a personal journey, one that continued in small ways every day. He had let go of the need to prove himself to others, and that release had freed him in ways he hadn't anticipated. One weekend, as Jake was organizing a volunteer event for veterans at a local community center, he found himself surrounded by people from all walks of life: young professionals, retired veterans, families, and even a few students. There was a warm sense of unity in the room, a collective appreciation for service and sacrifice. Jake felt humbled to be part of such an event, but this time, he didn't see himself as the organizer or leader. He was simply one of many people there to show gratitude and respect. As the event progressed, an older gentleman with a familiar face entered the room, slowly making his way toward Jake. It was Sam, the man whose quiet dignity had set Jake on this path of transformation. Sam's face lit up with recognition, and he extended his hand in greeting. Jake shook it, feeling a surge of gratitude and respect. "Good to see you again, son," Sam said with a knowing smile. "Looks like you've been busy." Jake chuckled, a bit taken aback by how much had changed since their first encounter. "You could say that," he replied. "I have you to thank for it. Meeting you changed everything." Sam nodded thoughtfully, his gaze steady. "Sometimes, life gives us a nudge when we least expect it. I'm glad you found your way." They shared a quiet moment, a mutual understanding passing between them. Sam's presence reminded Jake of how far he had come, but also of the journey that lay ahead. The change Jake had experienced was not something that could be completed. It was a continuous process, one that required honesty, humility, and a willingness to learn. As the evening came to an end, Jake took a moment to reflect on the path that had led him here. He realized that he no longer felt the need to control every aspect of his life. He was comfortable with the unknown, content to take each day as it came. His new sense of purpose was not defined by achievements or recognition, but by the impact he could have on others and the integrity with which he approached each moment. In the weeks that followed, Jake's life settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and profoundly different. His relationships deepened, his work became more meaningful, and his sense of self grew stronger. He no longer sought to escape his flaws or prove his worth. Instead, he embraced the complexity of who he was, finding strength in his vulnerability and wisdom in his imperfections. One evening, as he sat on his balcony watching the city lights, Jake felt a deep sense of gratitude. He had spent so long chasing an ideal, believing that change required perfection. But now, he understood that true growth came from accepting oneself fully, from learning to live with both the light and dark within. He had finally found peace, not in what he had achieved, but in who he had become. And that, he realized, was the greatest victory of all.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.